This is Stephen Foster with Stuart Brisley on the occasion of his John Hansard Gallery exhibition, Crossings. Stuart, I'd like to, first of all, explore how the idea for this exhibition first began. It features material relating to two sunken ships. I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about how you first began thinking about this.
I went to Helsinki about 10 to 12 years ago to do an exhibition, and I stayed on an island off the coast, 20 minutes from the passenger port. So every day I was taking a ferry back and forth, and I guess I'm a bit of a workaholic, and so I thought I would try to fill my time as a commuter by writing a diary of what I saw. And I wrote the diary, and then when I came back, after a few months, I looked at it again and again, and it became the germ of an idea about really about commuting and what happens sometimes in life where disasters occur. And there was a disaster in the Baltic Sea in 1994, which is concerning a ship called the RMS Estonia, where over 800 people died. And I began to think about work which involved the everyday activity of life, work, travel, and what can destroy it, or seemingly destroy it, like when things go completely out of control. And out of control in the sense that no one can do anything about it in the way nature actually operates. And the obvious other example of that is what happened with the Titanic. And the Titanic, as we know, left Southampton on its maiden voyage. And so those two things, in a sense, came together to provide the basis for making work in Southampton. So there's both the specific sense that in the history of Southampton, many of the crew who lost their lives on the Titanic were from Southampton. So it was a huge social trauma as far as the sinking of the MV Estonia is concerned. Many of the crew were from Tallinn in Estonia. Many Estonians died. But also so did Finns and Swedes, etc. So it has a kind of national resonance. Curiously, the loss of the MV Estonia in a way that can be compared with what happened to the Titanic, although the circumstances are entirely different.
Well, much of your work is highly politicised, and in fact you have an angle, and in some of our conversations you've talked about in many ways representing an age at both sides of the 20th century, really. And we've discussed the idea that at one end there's a kind of, if you like, an arrogance through a belief in technology, which might have replaced a previous age of the sublime, of a kind of fear of nature, which certainly represented the Titanic and caught us short in terms of our belief in technology. And at the other end of the century, a kind of conspiracy theory era, which still is with us now. Is that an underlying issue for the exhibition, do you think?
Yeah, well, that's part of it, yeah, definitely. The circumstances that make it receptive to conspiracy theory is the fact that the Swedish government put a moratorium on any disturbance of the wreck, and it's in international waters in the Baltic Sea, almost very quickly after the thing sank, which meant that there was an immense amount of speculation as to what happened. And also there was a developing sense of anger about the fact that people were unable to receive the bodies of those who died, who were still in the wreck, and they're still there to this day. So in a sense, the authorities' actions fueled the conspiracy world, as it were.
The cover-up.
Yes. And so there is a kind of, much like the kind of Kennedy assassination. There are a lot of arguments as to what might have happened or what are asserted to have happened.
And Princess Diana's death, of
yes,
course, as well, where
same
clearly
thing.
some cover-ups happen,
Yeah.
so all sorts of out of control.
And it's quite
conspiracies
natural in a sense, because a disaster like that sort of like shoots a hole through all of our sense of what society is and how protected we are and how secure we can feel. So, like sitting in a seat in a boat that travels daily back and forth, one doesn't have a sense of danger that it actually resides there all the time. So the shock of something actually happening, which is beyond everyone's control, breaks through the sense of how society is and how secure we all would like to feel.
You've become increasingly fascinated by this potential for rupture or potential for catastrophe, which I think you've said lives with us all the time. It's just kind of one step away, almost like another reality.
Yes, if one thinks of how the media now dominates aspects of what we call reality, there is a kind of deep fascination through the media about that potentiality for disaster. So it's almost kind of engendered, in a sense. It's psychically engendered into the society that this is going to happen. We currently are in the age of, and it is an age, I suspect, or becoming an age of serious climate change, and we know the scenarios. I mean, if you remember back to the 70s or maybe it was the 80s, with the nuclear winter argument, which was very persuasive, and many people, including me, thought, "My God, this is something we potentially have to face." And it rears its head again in another way, in the sense now, for example, the Gulf Stream may change its course, and we may end up having winters not quite dissimilar to those in Newfoundland. So always there is the potentiality for something to go beyond our experience, and there's something enjoyable about a kind of an indulgence in thinking about that, whereas actually the disasters occur probably just behind our left ears, where we least expect them to happen.
Do you think that gives us a sense of comfort that it isn't happening to us right now? That it gives us a sense
I think
of security?
there is an element of vicarious kind of enjoyment in something which we can sort of play around with imaginatively about disaster. It kind of gives our lives a kind of an edge, which maybe wouldn't be there.
Do you think that gives some explanation to Stockhausen's, what was considered to be a very outrageous statement, that Stockhausen's comment on the World Trade Center attack being the world's greatest work of art? He was obviously purposely being provocative, but I think there's a relationship between what he was saying, I think. If a work of art is an image, a memorable image, no one can deny that that's got to be one of the strongest and most long-lasting images one can imagine.
Well, I mean, but if you talk about the image, you're not talking about the disaster, and always there is that separation. So I think we can certainly kind of look at disasters in that kind of way, but only through the image, not through the actual event. The actual event is something else, which none of us can sort of experience again, only through the image. The image becomes a kind of another skin, as it were, which allows us to think about that. But the confrontation with it as a thing in itself is not something none of us can actually experience. We weren't there, and maybe many of those who were there didn't last beyond that point. They died. So these kind of disasters actually are like that. They are like black holes. And they throw up a kind of symbolic condition which we can then, through the lens of that, can sort of try to come to terms with. Of course, we never do.
When you were researching the Titanic aspect of this, and of course we have particular resources here in Southampton through the Oral History Unit, you kind of discovered a lot of controversies that even after all these years.
I make no claim to having any authority about what happened with the Titanic, by the way. I'm no expert at all. But I have a certain interest from a particular position, and from that position could say that from what I've read of the official report, for example, by the British government, which took place shortly after the Titanic sank, there was the authorities' position was not concerned necessarily to cover anything up, but concerned to deal with matters as they understood them at the time, and from the evidence of those who had been on the ship at the time, who were invited to speak or who were to give evidence. That meant that many official people gave evidence and some others. The outcome of that, one of the outcomes of that was, for example, when Lord Mersey, who was I guess the chairperson of the inquiry, made a statement that, for example, many more people in steerage in third class died, it's common knowledge, than did in the second and first class. And there are all kinds of ways of looking at the statistics to try and prove and disprove that. The fact remains that many more people died in steerage. Lord Mersey suggests in his comments that the reason was probably due to the fact that people in steerage were unwilling to be parted from their luggage, and therefore they stayed on the ship until it was too late. Not taking into account and not mentioning the fact that all the doors in steerage were locked by law because people in third class and steerage were prohibited from having communication with the other two classes, second and first class, because of the fear of spread of infectious diseases. So it was both law in American law and also British law, as far as I understand. So when it came to leaving, escaping, there were certain inhibitions. Now, this is much later on, and this is why it's so interesting with the Titanic. Much later on, there are many more testaments of people who survived, who weren't in any kind of position of authority, who weren't, shall we say, rich and famous, as some people of first class were, and therefore their voices were heard, who gave testament to their families, etc. And these have, become common information, either through the net, or either through the web, or there have been numerous books and so forth. So we have far greater view, a much more rounded view of what happened. There's a report from a man called Krikorian, who came from eastern Turkey, who was a member of a party of people in steerage who axed down the doors to break out. So they did actually kind of make great efforts, and some of them got through. Krikorian survived. It's kind of rather interesting. Out of 6 people from Turkey, he's the one that survived, and his testament comes up much later, with his family and so forth. So we get these kinds of little points. Another woman, for example, Tula, I think her name was, an 18-year-old Finnish woman who was in the steerage in the bow, and they were at the bottom. So when the ship grazed the iceberg, the steerage in the front, which was exclusively for women, got the full brunt of this kind of scraping and became frightened early on. And they got dressed and they went up to get up higher up on deck to get away from it all and to escape very early on. And what happened was that they got through a door, but there was a crew member standing there and said, "You're not allowed out here." And they wouldn't take any notice of him, so he let them go, but he locked the doors and chained the doors behind them so nobody else could come out of that door from steerage. And because he was still probably acting according to the law, i.e. people from steerage had to be separated. So, it's quite clear that there were inhibitions that were placed upon steerage people that weren't on second and first class people. Not because of intention necessarily, and all the rest of it, but because of the regulations. Just as it is quite true that the regulations as to the number of lifeboats on the Titanic accounted for, as far as places were concerned, just over half of the numbers of people on the ship. Now, this was also within the regulations, because it was felt the lifeboats wouldn't be used in the way that they subsequently had to be used, that they would be used more to ferry people from one boat to another, that always there would be numbers of ships within the vicinity, etc. You know. And also, for example, other views, like the ship was going very fast. Some people argue that one of the managing directors on board the Titanic, whose name I've forgotten, was pressing the captain to make the ship go as fast as possible to make a record crossing. You can see why that would be, done if it was done. But that's not necessarily true. It could be. The other argument is that it was quite reasonable to go through the ice field at speed, because icebergs are big objects, even if only 1/9 of them, or between 1/7 and 1/9, stick out of the water. They're that big; they're going to be easily seen. And so there was no need really to go slowly. Mm-hmm. So there are numbers of views, etc., which led to the fact that the regulations only accounted for just over half of the people on the ship that the places were available for them on the lifeboats. You put that together with the fact that when the lifeboats went down, they had to be lowered. And there were great dangers, because the boat is not sitting like that. All kinds of things are happening.
It's moving.
We can't sort of imagine, perhaps, or everything that happened. Some of them were only half filled. Some of them were less than that, and they wanted to get away from the ship as far as possible because of fear of being sucked down with the boat. So they didn't actually necessarily stop to pick up people in the water. So, altogether, the whole thing was a kind of disaster beyond which you can sort of like say, oh, well, like there were deliberate arguments about, keeping the steerage back, giving privileged people, more places. I don't think that was necessarily true, although there may be individuals who thought that and who acted in that way. But it wasn't policy, I'm sure,
Turning to the exhibition, on the face of it, it appears to be quite a minimal exhibition. 2 spaces with an object in one and a film in the other, which you've made. But sound is very important, and in many ways, although we can't hear it at the moment, it's almost like a giant sound sculpture. Sound's obviously clearly important in this installation. Right. I wonder if you could say a bit about that.
Well, there are 2 parts to the exhibition. One is a video, which is concerned with the MV Estonia, and the other part is the real boat, which represents the lifeboats in a way. Boat. Both of these events are very well documented in all kinds of ways. They're almost like projects of their own. They have their own volatility, and there isn't much point in adding to it or trying to be definitive about what happened, for example. So I've taken a minimal approach to it, and for example, the title of this work is called Touching the Blackberg. I don't know whether I should be talking about the Blackberg. Maybe I should, in order to sort of make sense of it. The Blackberg is a term given to icebergs which the surfaces have melted. It's a bit like black ice. So that, as far as the Titanic was concerned, the berg that hit it was called a blackberg. It's asserted it was the blackberg. We can't say definitively, but it was asserted it was. What that means is that it reflected the light coming from whatever source, or the absence of light. So on that night, it was a starry night, but there was no moon. And it was very dark in consequence, or dark in consequence, and so the surface of the iceberg reflected that darkness. It became like a dark mirror. Add to that the fact that the water was at more or less 0 degrees centigrade, and was and there's a term in French Canadian, I don't know how to pronounce this, called frazzle. And what that means is where snow has kind of fallen into the sea, and the sea wants to freeze. The water needs to freeze. It's at freezing point, but it can't because of the movement of its movement, and therefore it kind of there's a suppression of wave movement, and the surface gets an oily sheen to it apparently. And if there's a suppression of wave movement, if normally the waves would be hitting the iceberg and you get that white froth or whatever, and you'd see it, but actually with this Frasil water, you don't. So the little clues that tell you there's something ahead are reduced, and this is what they were facing when they went into this and when they hit the ice field. Now, the sound is important because, as far as I know, there isn't any kind of sound recording of what happened. So there's nothing to do with veracity in the sense of like photography or whatever sound recording that we can actually use easily. It's not there. So I wouldn't have used it anyway because what I'm trying to produce is to produce an emotional tension with sound, combined with few pieces of text, few pieces of spoken text, which give a sense of what is happening, and not to try to sort of come to terms with the whole mass of material. It's like trying to make a work of the Bible. It's not possible. So it's actually touching. So the ship touches the Blackberg and gets a scrape. This work touches the whole idea of the sinking, only touches it, but offers a way of sensing or feeling the, if you like, the pressure, the weight, the tension, the power of the event, combined with just a few pieces of text which amplify it. I hope. That's what I'm trying to do, including a very short piece by somebody who actually was there at the age of 8, a woman called Eva Hart, who I believe Sheila Jemima from the Oral History Programme here in Southampton actually made an interview with. And my own view of listening to lots of bits of text on the, here, there and everywhere, from people talking about how they survived the Titanic. This is one of the most succinct, clear pieces, quite objective, distant thinking about what happened, and it's utterly chilling because it's sort of everyday language, spoken in a very calm voice about something, describing the horror of the event. Sounds should amplify that, help it to,
Indeed.
So the sound becomes really important. But without the boat, it doesn't work. The boat without the sound, in my view, wouldn't work. So together, they actually operate in relation to each other, and so that the audience is invited to contemplate the sound through the boat through the sound, in relation to the whole idea of the sinking of the Titanic, and in relation to being on a site not far from where the ship actually left, in a city of which there will be descendants of those who died, some hundreds.
This may not be correct, but film seems to have become an increasingly important medium for you. We've shown a number of films, commissioned a number in quite the recent past, and film has always been important to you in terms of recording and documenting. But as a filmmaker,
I've never believed in the word document or recording. No. I mean, I think this is what we're doing. The process is recording. What happens afterwards, you make something else out of it. So that's my argument. Yeah. So film has been part of what I've done. And
I wanted to just touch on that.
Yeah, that's right.
Finally, I think that you're for many, many years you've been internationally known as a performance artist, but actually the range of media with which you've used throughout your life has been very varied. painting, drawing,
sure.
filmmaking.
Yeah.
You see them all as a coherent and related approach to making work as an artist?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No, because like it's about. I regard myself as maybe it's as a contradiction in terms, like working in an interdisciplinary way, and a lot of this does actually stem from performance, because the ideas I had about performance when I started doing it, we're talking about the 60s, late 60s, was the use of the body, but more than that, the direct relation with people, audience, was very important, to do away with the middleman, and it was connected to all the progressive politics of the time in the 60s moving into the 70s. And stemming out of that and thinking of in art, within the art frame, as it were, the use of the body, what does it mean? I mean, is it just the body as an object? But the body also contains within it, like the mind, and is redolent with feeling and sensation, and actually has the means of communication highly developed, and so why not use it? So the voice becomes important, and that opens up everything. As soon as you open up the voice in relation to the body as in performance, one is in a complex condition, and my work as operating in an interdisciplinary fashion actually stems from recognizing that complexity and trying to come to terms with it in different ways.
That sounds like a very unifying body of work to me. In fact,
good.
Stuart, thank you very much.